slide deck, and thank you for saying what you just said. I started recording.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, happy to do that. Good. Okay, well, we have a lot to cover, and so I'm going to jump right in. I'd like to make this be a very, very informal and informative discussion, so interrupt at any point in time if you have any questions for clarification or otherwise. Our team that's been working on the project went through this yesterday in terms of the points that we would like to cover. Our thought is that we would try to run through this pretty quickly. So this isn't, a piece of this, and maybe a half or a little bit more, is actually a presentation, and then it can be an open discussion, because I'm sure all of you have questions, and comments that you want to make. So rather than we just have a presentation and shut this down. So that's the idea. A lot of you are coming into this conversation, from different points, and so I'm going to first spend a little bit of time just running through sort of some background to bring everybody up to speed, and so we're all starting from the same point. So what we're really, let me get a couple things out of the way here. Can you all see my slide? Let me just make sure of that.
I'm not seeing a slide.
I see a gray screen that says review of the Mojave RCA.
Oh, now something's coming up.
Things happening.
Yep.
All right, good. Make no assumptions here. Okay, so ultimately what we're doing, and this slide sort of shows that, is that we are working to refine a method to identify conservation values on an ecoregional scale, across the state, and provide tools and important contextual information that will allow people to use this to advance their own objectives. So this is, just trying to figure out there we go. This is part of an initiative that's being coordinated by the Strategic Growth Council under the Integrated Regional Conservation Development Program. And this program was initiated a number of years ago with the understanding that we don't have enough conservation information available for developers and conservationists and for different kinds of planning up front, and it results in a relatively inefficient process, both in terms of time and money and results. And so the model that we've been working under is that if we have a green print, a regional conservation assessment that uses the best of our knowledge, and that's developed up front, then that can help direct conservation and development activities. For development activities, it can help move things into the avoidance and minimization part of the mitigation hierarchy. And where there is development with unavoidable impacts, then we have a pretty clear, or we have a clearer idea as to where any investments should be made to have the highest conservation impact associated with those investments. And so what we've embarked on is really trying to advance the concept of regional conservation assessments, and so that we can really get them in place on a region-by-region basis to help guide these different conservation development actions. This all started before the development of AB 2087, but there was significant effort to make sure that there were components of RCA language that were carried within 2087. For those of you who are familiar with this or not familiar, there's three different components of AB 2087. There's a regional conservation assessment, which identifies sort of the broader conservation priorities on a broad scale. This is optional. And then there's a regional conservation investment strategy, which is usually sub-eco-regional, which does a more detailed conservation assessment and identifies important mitigation lands that then can go into a process to result in a mitigation credit agreement. Within 2087, it refers to regional conservation assessments, as I said, as optional, but it says where they have been completed, they need to be taken into account in terms of how they were used to develop the regional conservation investment strategy. So part of what we're trying to address here is to provide a standard context that would go into an RCIS, on the one hand, with a full realization that they're really important for a lot of other planning activities at the county level, land trust level, and on and on. But I just wanted to throw this out because the question is how does this all fit? We're working very closely with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and actually what we're working on right now is actually being put forth as the first pilot RCA under 2087 to help inform how that should roll out in the future also. The people that have been working on this overall project, or the groups, there's been an interagency working group for the overall Integrated Regional Conservation Development Program with the organizations that you can see listed on this slide. And then there's a project that was funded now by the Wildlife Conservation Board to actually allow us to demonstrate this on two different ecoregions, one information-rich ecoregion and one relatively information-poor ecoregion, to basically walk through the methodology that was developed by the interagency working group and test and refine it and work with partners to move it forward. The partners on this particular project, again, the Growth Council is coordinating the project. The Conservation Biology Institute is a key partner and contractor on this, as well as UC Davis. And it's also being done in partnership with the Energy Commission in terms of helping develop the methodology and co-funding some of the work. And there's representatives of these different partner groups on the call today. And as I mentioned
just real quickly,
yes, please.
Is anyone's slides, this is Kate, is anyone's slides changing? I'm still on the mainstreaming of development of RCA assessments. Maybe it's just a problem on my end.
Okay. Yes, it sounds like it might be your computer, Kate.
Okay, I will exit and try back in again. Sorry for the disruption.
No, I'm sorry that you haven't been able to see it, but I will send them around.
Thank you.
But and then there's three different teams that have been created, with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to make sure that all of this is really advancing with their understanding, ideally translates to with their blessing. But the end goal is to give them, more tools. And obviously, most of the data that's going into the system is information that they have either developed and are curated and or are making available. So to make sure that all of that information is being used most appropriately. The different teams there's a technology team to talk about sort of the technology relationship between what we're building and what they've already built. There's the science team and data team that is discussing sort of, again, what's in BIOS and VegCamp and ACE2 and coming out as ACE3 to make sure that all of these things are well connected and we're using information to the best possible advantage. And then there's just a leadership team to make sure that the branch chiefs and others are being kept abreast and providing input as we go forward. So the project that WCB is funding, as I mentioned before, is really testing and refining the methodology in 2 demonstration ecoregions, and the specific deliverables include sort of the biodiversity and conservation value data set to provide the foundation for planning, technology platform to explore and identify areas of conservation value for selected targets, and then information context to help select areas with a high probability of long-term conservation success and achieving co-benefits of particular ecosystem services, and then specific tools to evaluate the effectiveness of proposed projects or activities relative to stated conservation goals. We have now got one of the things that's really different in terms of what we're doing as compared to NCCPs, HCPs, and a lot of other projects in the past is we're actually including a broader suite of conservation targets. You know, more species, vegetation types, and special habitats. For the Mojave, which is one of our demonstration regions, we're basically looking at incorporating around 400 conservation targets into the analysis, and currently, in fact, this is an old number right now, there's around 181 that we're actually going to be dynamically demonstrating sort of what we're doing with them as we move forward. They include all of the listed species. They're also, we'll be including all of those that have G1 and G2 and S1 and S2 ranks from the network of heritage programs, NatureServe. And then species of greatest conservation concern, CNDB, 1B, and 2B plant species. We're including all of the different species and focal conservation targets that have been identified in any existing HCP or NCCP or activity like the RACP or RCIS. And as I mentioned, all the S1 and S2 vegetation alliances through the Manual of California Vegetation are being identified, and then there's a process of identifying what else is missing that we all know is of great conservation concern, whether it be seeps or serpentine barrens or other factors that we know should be included. So we've gone through major tables and lists that have been generated, determining their priorities to include things, different species here, as well as this is the list of vegetation alliances that's found in the Mojave, and the third column, Mojave name, basically is a crosswalk to the vegetation maps that have been created, you know, and sort of those map categories to the different vegetation types. So we're working very closely with Todd Keeler-Wolf in the Veg Camp group to bring that information together. Once we have the list of targets, then we're really looking to demonstrate how they're distributed across the ecoregion. And this is just a 2 different points here to talk about. We're using 3 different kinds of information to go into this. One is point locations where people have been on the ground and they've identified that this particular thing is found in this particular place. And so there's a high level of confidence in terms of the accuracy of what it is and where it is. And then there's distribution models where that level of confidence is a little bit less. And then there's expert range maps, more general maps where the confidence is less. And we're using the level of confidence to basically dilute the conservation values in the sense that there's whether or not there's a high probability of it being found within that distribution map. The rest of these numbers are the numbers of animals and plants and ecosystems and sort of where we are in our process of having distribution maps associated with those. So with the information that's in our system right now, if you were just to look at the number of conservation targets per grid, we're using a 1 kilometer grid to aggregate this information. This is the kind of map that you would come up with, which is similar to the kinds of products that came out of ACE2, where the number of things are just tallied by a particular place across the geography, and but there's not a differentiation between the conservation importance of one thing and another. It's just telling you where there's more things there. So what we're doing is basically, in addition to showing the number of things that are there and being able to explore that, we're basically providing a conservation value for each target, knowing full well that some things have a greater conservation value than others. We started by just looking at the legal status, but through input we've gotten from multiple sources, we're basically going to change that to not have the conservation value associated with the legal status, which is a more of a political process, but more of a conservation value with the G ranks and the S ranks and all the different factors that go in there. So this is being changed. But basically, we're creating a conservation value layer that demonstrates not only the conservation value, but also the level of confidence relative to those 3 different ways that we're portraying the distribution. And so each of the different targets will have, that conservation value for that target, across the surface, and then those are being stacked on top of one another, and then being normalized basically to show the ramp of where there's greater conservation value and less. And so this was the map that we showed in the beginning, and this for the 181 targets, one of the concerns that we had at the beginning of the project is once you start including this many conservation targets, the concern was, well, does that mean that every place is going to be important for something? And so the whole map is going to basically turn gray. And so before we had some of the results, we were anticipating that and we wanted to test it. I'm not sure exactly where we're going to go with this, but but what it does show is that the map on the left is for the whole ecoregion, and then we ran the exact same analysis for each of the ecoregional subsections and showed sort of the distribution of conservation values based on the same algorithms per subsection. So, and so obviously there's lots that can be done with that. So, Jim and Dustin, let me pass this over to one of you, if I can find where there it is. And perhaps you could just show some of these pieces on the screen.
Okay.
So,
before you go, sorry for the interruption. Can we ask, you want me to hold off on questions till the end?
If there's a clarification question, that'd be great.
Okay, so on slide 11 that you were just showing, I didn't quite understand what the grayscale at the bottom, the conservation index with the -2 to +2 standard deviation range.
Okay.
I didn't understand that part.
can I pass that question to Jim or Dustin?
Sure.
Yeah, not a problem. This is Dustin. That was just referring to the normalization process. So when it's going through and getting converted to fuzzy, and Jim can show it on the screen here if we looked at the model, but it's essentially taking the weighted species richness and turning it into the final output. And the way that got stretched, where we had a true and a false threshold, we took the mean plus 2 standard deviations and set that as a true threshold. So that's the dark blue you're seeing on the screen. And then we took the mean minus 2 standard deviations to set the false threshold, which is the dark red you're seeing on the screen.
Thanks. That's great. Thanks, Dustin. I get it.
Yep. No problem.
Okay. Well, what I want to show, and I want to take a minute or two to explain some of the differences, because I mean, a lot of you on the line have helped generate these models in previous projects for the West Mojave. We worked together on the RCIS in Antelope Valley, and I think it's going to be helpful to try to differentiate what these things are so it's less confusing. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes trying to do that. And anywhere along the way, you can just stop me. So as Denny was pointing out, a couple of the main differences, we're looking at the whole Mojave. We're including many more targets than anything that we've done together before, whether it's for DRECP or the West Mojave work or the RCIS, which much fewer number of targets. So that's one of the main differences in this one. We're still using logic models that you guys have helped us build in the past, so that should be familiar to most of you. And if you're not, you can always call and we'll walk you through these to get you feeling more comfortable with it if it's alien for you at this point. So don't worry if you've never seen this before. We can get you caught up very quickly, but we'll do that in a different setting. So I also want to point out a couple of other things. So Denny mentioned that we're looking at these 400-ish targets. The model that you're looking at on screen includes only 181 of those. We're including the rest as we go, so this is still a work in progress. The model results you see here is looking at the Mojave in its totality, all of the targets loaded all at the same time. So this is showing 181 targets, where it's blue. In this case, the stretch is blue is highest value, red is lowest value, just so you get a feel for that color range. And in this particular model, we were trying to emphasize the endangered versus threatened versus other, and we had it weighted in that way. So the endangered species had the highest weighting in the model, threatened was in the middle, and everything else was at the end. As he also explained, we're going to be shifting that and reflecting more of its state rank versus the legal status. So that's actually, in my opinion, that's actually a great improvement, because it's really stating the condition of the targets, not some legal definition of whether it's endangered or not. I mean, there's so much politics to that, as you well know. So I think that's an improvement. But a couple things I want to show. So what you're looking at is the whole Mojave, all 181, and you can kind of see the pattern. And just like we did in the RCIS, those of you who were on that remember that we were trying to break things up into major habitat types. You recall we looked at ag and grasslands, separated from desert, separated from foothills, riparian. And there was a rationale for that, which I think was quite successful for that focal area, particularly one that had a lot of ag land. But we kind of stepped back away from that, and we said, not that it's, I shouldn't say the word step back, because it makes it sound like it wasn't the right way, because it's just a different way. But we're trying to standardize it for the state. And so we're going to take we were exploring the same type of approach, but now we're looking at ecological subsections and keeping it standardized instead of looking at it through this major habitat type filter. Both have value. It's one that we're advancing right now. So let me show you when we do that, what it looks like when we run the model individually for each ecological subsection in this geography, and we pluck out the highest and lowest value areas within the ecological subsection. You'll see a different pattern emerge in just a second. So think of it like if you're looking at the whole Mojave, where in the whole Mojave do you have the highest concentrations? I'm going to click things on and off for a second so you can get your heads around it. Look at the Owens Valley and Death Valley as two stark examples. I'm going to turn back on the overall one. You see a good portion of Owens Valley is dark blue, a good portion of Death Valley is dark red. So the highest value, and now I want to ask the question, within the Owens Valley, where are the better places? Or within the Death Valley are the better places? And that's what this map is trying to convey. You can see you've improved your resolution at the ecological subsection level. So both of these have value. You can look at it from the lens of the whole place, and then you zoom in and you can look at the differentiation within place. And there's a lot of detail around it. And you guys have seen this before. I mean, we can click on these and you can see all the species that might be encountered. I'll do a little of those. And then I've got one more thing to show you on this. So hang on a second. So if we go here, I'll let it clear up. It might be a delay on your screen. I'll give it a few more seconds. And I go into here and I'm saying, well, why is this a dark blue? And you're going to see, like we've seen before, there are 26 different targets represented in this blue pixel. The resolution, again, folks, is a kilometer on the side, right? So if you go through there and what we've got, we've tied it up to the models. So for, in this case, pallid bat, you can see it, bright yellow will show up, and that's the model distribution for pallid bat. And so I can go through and scroll through all of these. You've seen something similar to this before. Here's golden eagle, and the list goes on, right? Here's a Horn's milk vetch, etc. So that's a way of not only understanding what might be present in that location, but also you get a sense of its model distribution elsewhere. So you actually get a couple of extra pieces of information as you go. Okay, so I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'll pause and let you guys ask some. Actually, I'm going to do two more things. I lied. And then I'll let you ask some questions. Let me go back for a second. Of applying the different the weightings based on state rank versus this endangered, threatened, and legal status stuff. So let me show you what that looks like. It's going to be similar, but a bit different. So I'm going to put the swiper on, and I'll show you what that looks like. So hang on. So the map on the right is based on legal status. The map on the left as I swipe is going to be based on state rank. So I'm going to go slow and I'll go back again. You can see it's similar, but not identical. You can see some of the eastern Mojave brightening up. This is largely driven by some of the plants that we've got loaded. We don't have a lot of the plants loaded yet, but they're coming. I'll go back again so you can get a feel for it. The pattern is similar. Now we're in the process of running the same model with this new weighting structure on the ecological subsections, but that's not quite ready yet. We couldn't show it to you today because it's not done. Our suspicion is that it's going to be quite a bit different, but we don't know yet, and we'll show it to you as soon as it gets done. So it's not far off. The last thing I want to show, let me turn off the swiper tool for a second. And I want to go to this one. And I wanted to, well, let's not do that. Let's just do this one. I wanted to show and zoom in on when we worked together on the West Mojave. I wanted to compare the two because you guys helped build that model. And I wanted you to see how it compares to the new one that has a lot more targets, right? I thought you'd be interested in seeing that. So the model that's going to show up, and sorry about the color. So in this case, I'm not going to mess with the legend. the dark green has the highest value. The real dark burgundy is lowest value. You can see we remember we punched out the big playas at the Air Force Base. This is Lancaster and Palmdale, and you kind of can get that perspective, right? So this was the results of that. And so if I put the swiper on again and I go up here, you can see that the pattern is very similar, but it won't be identical because the model that's the green and burgundy had far fewer targets, if we're going to use that terminology, or species, versus the one on the blue to red, which includes, in this case, 181. But it's similar. It's not identical.
But and in addition, and I think this is really the main point that we're really trying to explore and to make, is that not only is there a different number of targets, the targets are being added up differently, but we're really looking at what's important on a broader ecoregional context.
So that's what I've got for now, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys might have.
Jim, could you also just do a quick draw of a site? I think that'll support the comments I'll make in a couple minutes.
Okay. You want me to do
just draw, a polygon and do an intersection.
That's what you want me to do. Okay.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to make it smaller. I'm going to make it a rectangle. So which ones do you want me to run this on? This one? You want them both? Just the one? Just this one?
This is Gary from Audubon.
Hi, Gary.
Hey, Jim. While you're doing this, let me just ask again about the treatment of agricultural lands. How are you treating them?
Yeah,
conservation.
Yeah, in this particular assessment, Gary, we're not plucking those out as a special feature. We did that for the RCIS, though, right? We highlighted it there. We didn't do. This is looking at the targets only. We're not, and in our subdivisions, we're based on ecological subsections, which doesn't afford us to highlight the agricultural lands in this particular model. But we can catch it in the other type, though, right?
Well, and we're also capturing that, and that's actually a question that will be posed to the group. Is putting into the same system important contextual data sets. So if we have maps of important ag lands, and we have a couple other ecological service values, that people can see these conservation values relative to that information.
The reason I bring it up, Danny, is because the ag lands can be very important to birds, especially for foraging. So they have a higher conservation value for wildlife than you might think.
And do you think that would not be captured within the distribution maps and models?
I don't know how much you want to refine it to where we've seen birds in agriculture or not, but generally we've captured it before and added a conservation value in the other models.
We have a lot of assumptions going in here, and that's one of mine, and it may be an ignorant one, that where, any habitat, regardless of whether it's a managed habitat, if it's a good habitat for any particular species, that would be included, within the distribution model. But that may not be the case.
Then you have to include ag lands.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. So that's something that we can check. So we have two different ways of looking at that right now. One is again, the assumption and the hope that all land use types and land cover types would be included in the distribution model for particular species that are important for, for their habitat. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, we can add additional contextual layers, and we will be adding those to represent these different land use and land cover types, and so they can be taken into account.
Great. And Jim has done this before, and so has Dustin. So
yeah. Back to you, Jim.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to say that might help people keep some of this clear, and I'm sorry about the complexity of all this. When you have different things going on in the same geography, it can be kind of unsettling because you're trying to figure out what the hell's going on. Because there's so much of this is similar but different, and so trying to keep that all straight, I know, is a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us, but we're trying our best to make sure that that is as clear as we can make it. But before I stop, and I'll turn it back over to Denny, and he can speak to this analysis that I just ran. Another distinction from the model we're doing for the RCA versus the model we were running for the West Mojave or the RCIS. A couple of other things that stand out as being different, being handled in a different way. In the model that we built, we've included things like the connectivity mapping was part of the model itself. We also included a whole vegetation representation assessment element to it. And we also added in some of the pre-existing areas that were identified as high value, right, in various iterations of our models. And this is a different form. Those things would be included later as ancillary contributions and not embedded into the model itself. And that's a major distinction that you guys should know about. So I think that's it. Denny, do you want to describe this for folks, or?
Sure, and all I wanted, because so there's a couple different ways, and all of you who have been working with Jim and and these viewers in the systems, will have seen many or most of these, So on the one hand, as Jim showed, once we've got a representation, of the biodiversity and the conservation value, one can look at any pixel and go through, see what's intersected, and present in that pixel, and dig into that, and or one can create, a polygon, a site of interest, and do an intersection across that whole site of interest and generate an intersection report that will show, like what's on the screen right now, all of those different things that were intersected and the extent to which they were intersected. The reason that bring this up is one of the organization that's funding this exercise right now, Wildlife Conservation Board, is trying to address some of the issues that were brought up in its last strategic plan, that they need a more transparent process to identify why they selected different lands for funding for conservation, and so this will allow them, and there's many other uses, but as an example, to put in different projects, and run it against the conservation priorities, and then just to see very, very clearly, how different projects address the objectives of the conservation dollars. So, go ahead.
One other thing for clarification for folks. So many of you on the phone have been working closely with us and Scott with the Energy Commission on the environmental land use reporter. And that's a special application that is tied to data basin, but it isn't the same thing, as you know, and we've talked about this before, and we're about to go through another round of modification of that. And you've been part of that, and you will continue to be part of that. And what Denny's describing as one of the deliverables for the Wildlife Conservation Board is kind of an iteration of that. And what we're trying to do now with Scott's help is to find a way to standardize that, so we don't have, a bunch of different tools running around. We want to have one that has all of the elements that people can use to make these decisions. And you've seen that work before, and we've made some advancements that we don't have time to show today, but we will in a meeting soon to get additional feedback. So that's a joint Energy Commission WCB thing that you guys will get a chance to critique here before too long.
Okay. So to not be a total liar and not give you time to talk, I'm just going to run through a couple things really quickly. I think most of you get a sense of what we're doing here, but a couple things that we haven't identified. So let me just make sure that I do those. So the other thing that we've mentioned a couple times is other data layers that we're bringing in the system so people can bring them up and see them as context relative to the conservation value. And basically they fall into three different categories. There's opportunity data layers, which include corridors and connectivity, ownership, landscape integrity, the SWAP priority areas, and we can add more to this. Threat, imminence of development, fragmentation of the landscape, invasive species, and areas that are slated for extensive impact relative to climate change. And then talking about three different ecosystem service co-benefits layers, areas that have been identified important for groundwater recharge, for carbon sequestration, and ag lands, prime ag lands. And so these are basically put forth there. So again, if somebody has a couple options to protect what they're interested in protecting, and they can see them relative to these threats and opportunities and ecosystem service co-benefits, that can help inform their decision in terms of where they may want to go. So we're working right now, so this is like work in progress, but just to give you an idea of the interface that we're working to create to allow people to interact with this data. And I'm only going to point out those things that, we'll point out things that we haven't talked about. So basically one will be able to jump into on ecoregions and select an ecoregion, and then we basically have, and this is new and this is important, to this discussion, 4 different products that people can zoom in on and just see the conservation values associated with those. There's different audiences that need to be satisfied here. Once we have all the information in the system, we can slice and dice that to address these needs. One is all conservation targets, and this, in our working group, particularly those non-regulatory agencies, have been wringing their hands, and we all know that there's a lot of conservation value associated with, this thing. It doesn't have legal status, so it never gets on the map. It never gets in the process. So part of what we're doing is we're really being inclusive and bringing in all of those things that we recognize, creating parameters of what to include and what not to include. So that's one, and you can just say, show me everything. Show me all 400 of these things that you're talking about. The other is, if I go across the street and talk to Caltrans, or I talk to U.S. Fish and Wildlife or California Department of Fish and Wildlife, they say, yeah, we're kind of interested in that, but we have legal responsibilities, and we just need to know where the values are for those things that we're responsible for managing in one way, shape, or form, or managing our impacts. And so the other is just those things that have legal status. And show me what my mitigation burden is. Show me those. Then the third one is just show me those things with high conservation status, those things that are S1 and S2 across the board. And then the fourth is a more customized version so that, and there will be a model running in the background, depending on what you're choosing, that then will do all the mathematical analysis, and create this ramp, based on the spread of values across the landscape. But the other is for those that just really want to look at a subset of these conservation targets to see just those conservation values across the landscape. We're building features that will allow them to drill down, identify which species, which ecosystems, which focal ecosystems and special features that they want to C, so they can customize what is it that I want on and what is it that I want off. So if the Wildlife Conservation Board has a bond that's just really directed to protect species A, B, and C within this particular habitat, they can turn everything else off and just have that and see the conservation values distributed across the landscape for those items. And then they can run the model, run the analysis. The EAMS model will run in the background and generate sort of those values just of those things that they're interested in. So I'm not going to repeat the pieces because we've basically walked through them, and I want to hear your thoughts. But the next steps is we're filling some key data gaps, we're refining the value model, building the user interface, interacting with the public like this call here, and then we're going to be starting to work on the MODOC, which is the second ecoregion, and refining specific tools for Wildlife Conservation Board. Let me stop. I'm sorry I went as long as I did, but please provide some feedback, questions, comments. So what are we missing? Are there any concerns out there? And how do you want to be engaged moving forward? Those are really my questions.
So I can ask the question, Denny. This is Gary from Audubon. So we have these models. We've identified these high conservation values by species, groups of species. What role does this play? And for instance, if it's high-speed rail, whatever the project is, won't the project have to also do some on-site data collection?
Great.
And how will that fit into to use data that actually will change the model or better inform the model?
So this is a great question. You brought up something that I meant to mention, so you reminded me to mention it. So this is really not a site analysis tool. It's not going to identify specific properties on the ground. It really is to provide a broader context at a ecoregional scale as to where the conservation values are and where the opportunities are for conservation success, in achieving some other co-benefits with that selection. So this then would, provide that context that something like a high-speed rail analysis, something like an RCIS, something like a more detailed analysis of impacts and mitigation opportunities would then take this to know what they should be working with and where are those general areas where there's the highest probability of successful mitigation and conservation that they should be working in, but then they would need to drop down another level to do that more detailed analysis. This is not going to identify anybody's property as, this is really, really important or this is really not important. That's actually one of the parameters that we've been working with, is to not go down to that level because the information that we've gathered is not at that resolution.
Right, and we've gotten some pushback from landowners, so from previous.
I do, and that's one of the reasons we're putting this forward, as providing that context, but not providing the detailed solution.
Thank you.
Hey, Denny, when you guys are doing species and you were doing the isolating it down to S rank, what range of S ranks did you do for species?
Well, we're doing, and so who is the question from?
Sorry, this is Greg Suba from CNPS.
Hey, Greg. So we're actually thinking about that right now. The change from using legal status to using the S ranks is one that we're just incorporating. In fact, between our call yesterday, and today, Dustin and Jim have made enough progress to show that map that Jim just showed the slider bar on that shows the relationship of those. Would love to have your input associated with that. In terms of CNPS ranks, though, we're including all of the 1B and 2B plant species, which I think is around 300.
That's fantastic. I was asking that question really to set up an analog to talk about the plant communities, where you're included S1s and S2s, and I'm wondering about S3s, which are 50,000 acres or less within the state of California, which is a pretty small amount. And one could argue that S3s are threatened and rare themselves. And so I'm just wondering, I understand we can't do it all, but I'm wondering what the rationale is for cutting it off at the 2s and not the 3s for plant communities.
Well, I would say that right.
We'll look into that. Great.
Yep, that's what I was going to say. Right now, we're doing the exploration to sort of see, just looking at the other groups that I mentioned earlier, sort of what's been missing, and whether or not we have all the S1s and S2s. And I've been part of these discussions, with NatureServe and the Conservancy for years in terms of sort of where that cutoff is in terms of what should be included. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Yeah, it's 50,000 acres or less.
Okay. Any other comments, thoughts?
Yeah, this is Stephanie. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a question regarding coordination with Department of Fish and Wildlife on this methodology for RCAs and alignment with their guidelines, and then also a question on outreach or attempts to coordinate with San Bernardino County's effort to do an RCIS and integrate this information into their process. I think my mind is going to how do we coordinate all of this to actually result in coordinated, consistent, and effective mitigation on the ground and conservation. So I don't know if you've thought about those coordination pieces, but that's where I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, I think about it a lot, and it's still a work in progress from my perspective. We're having a lot of conversations with Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they're trying to figure out things as they go. As they're reviewing the first RCIS of Santa Clara right now and identifying things that they think worked and things that they think didn't work. It's not criticism of the contractor that was managing that, because they didn't have the guidelines done when that project started and for most of it. So now they're evaluating a product against a relatively new set of guidelines. I had a couple-hour meeting with those folks earlier this week. This is the first RCA that's coming out that follows those guidelines. And we really talked about the importance of creating a standardization and support to help people do this in a more standardized fashion, and not creating confusion. One of the concerns, from Kevin Hunting's level, is, would this raise the bar in terms of what it would take for people to do an RCA? And so that's one of the things we need to demonstrate that actually will help. But the more that we can show how it can directly feed into support, for an RCIS, the better. So I don't have a clean answer, Stephanie, to your question, other than to say that that's a really active part of what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah. Okay. I think the next meeting the San Bernardino County RCIS is having is on November 7th, where they're going to be talking about the covered species they've identified and the boundary and maybe some other things. But I'm just wondering if at some point it might, have you reached out to Mike Howard yet, the consultant that is working on that one?
I haven't, and that's a really good idea.
Yeah. Okay.
We have, Stephanie, Scott and I both have had some calls with Mike.
Oh, good. Okay. I just want him to know about this body of work as he's,
He does. Yeah. He's up to speed. In fact, we had a call last week with him.
Okay.
And this is Kate with Defenders, and I have a follow-up question to Stephanie's sort of structural question. I'm looking at the code in section 1853A, where it talks about RCAs are approved by the department only for the purposes of an RCIS. And I was looking at the footprint of the Mojave, and it seems like it extends far beyond where the known RCISs are being considered or developed. And so I'm wondering how that integrates in with what the code says.
So there's pieces of that are being worked on, you know, in terms of how RCAs fit into an RCIS. That's part of what we're trying to establish here. And obviously an RCIS is not using an ecoregion as a framework for the conservation analysis. But as it also says, you know, in that code, that where an RCA has been completed, that is has been reviewed and endorsed by the department, you know, that should be shown, that any RCIS should show how it used that. So that's what we're trying to establish here, is a standardized way to do this. Early analysis that we've done has shown that, you know, a lot of the regional conservation assessments, you know, have been, the boundaries for them have been relatively arbitrarily assigned relative to the project, you know, and distance from a particular project, and does not really have the right ecological context for conservation. And so the idea is that if an RCIS occurs within an ecoregion and there's an ecoregional level analysis, then the results from that analysis should help inform the RCIS. So one
their RCA as part of their work on an RCIS.
That's correct. We're doing 2 demonstration RCAs, you know, using the methods and the tools, and then we'll provide sort of the, you know, that information to help other people carry out RCAs. Ideally, how the RCAs, what we're trying to do right now is have a demonstration project that will make people turn around and sit up and say, aha, this is really important. This can be done with the information and the tools that were demonstrated on these 2 different ecoregions. You know, this is not as big of a hurdle, you know, to do, and it's an important thing to do, and so it will get done. You know, and then we'll figure out sort of how to get it done most efficiently across the board.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing, and this looks super interesting. I know Defenders would like to be engaged in it as you move forward.
Great. So are there any major red flags that any of you on the phone see relative to what we're doing that we should take into account?
No red flags, just more questions.
Okay. So, you know, I know that we're over time, but I do want to, you know, keep you engaged, and so probably we'll send out just a questionnaire to say, you know, to extract more of your feedback and to ask more questions about you in terms of how you want to be engaged in the future. And if any of you, you know, Greg and others, you know, see particular places where you would like to be part of the discussion, please reach out and let me know, and we'll make sure that you're included.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for taking the time to do this. And, you know, if you have any thoughts and comments, please share them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, Denny. Thanks, Denny.
Okay. Bye.